These days, artisan breads are so hot, and this bread is from one of the hottest bread bakers in New York and one of the hottest breads. It's adapted from Eli Zabar's raisin pecan bread, but this version is a walnut cranberry using dried cranberry. You know, bread baking is so much easier these days than ever before because of the instant yeast that doesn't require proofing. I'm Levy Beranbaum. Stay tuned to Baking Magic and you'll see just how much fun it is to make this sensational bread. Today I'm making a delicious bread, cranberry walnut bread. Making yeast bread these days is easier than it's ever been before because there's no danger of killing the yeast. The new type of powdered yeast that is called instant rise or rapid rise, you mix just right in with the flour. You don't have to proof it with water and wonder, is it too hot or do you have to worry about killing the yeast? It always will rise, it's no fail, and there's no longer any fear of making bread. I begin by toasting the walnuts because not only does that bring out the flavor of the walnuts, but it also keeps the dough from turning blue. You know how walnuts sometimes discolor in a cake or in a bread? Well, this completely deactivates the enzyme that does that. And also, it makes it easier to take the peel off of the nuts. You know that walnut has a little skin that's bitter. So while it's still warm, if you rub it in a paper towel or a cloth towel, it helps to eliminate that. You'd be surprised how much gets removed. So part of these walnuts is going to go into the bread with the cranberries. The rest of the walnuts gets processed or ground with the flour. So you can see already all these little particles are the skin of the walnuts, and we're going to leave that completely behind. Now I'm going to remove a half of a cup to add with my flour mixture. It's about a half a cup. And the rest of it, the 1.5 cups, will be broken into coarse pieces. Now, of course, you can chop it. If you're doing many breads, you'll want to chop it. But for just one bread, I tend to just break it into coarse little particles and put it in the bowl. Now I have these nice coarse walnuts to use for the filling. And I'm going to start making the dough. And this is the half cup of walnuts that I put in. I'm using part whole wheat flour. You know, a bread made with all whole wheat flour is very dense because there's very little gluten protein in whole wheat. But a little bit of it gives it an incredible lift in flavor. Now the bread flour. And if you use unbleached all-purpose, that will be a little more tender if you prefer less chewy bread. And now the instant yeast, so you can put it directly in. That's a great advantage. But I'm only using part of the instant yeast. Part of it will go into the starter that I'm making, and part of it will go into the finished dough. And that's what gives it the extra special flavor by fermentation. Fermentation is the process of the yeast. When it is liquefied, when there's moisture and flour, when it starts eating breaking down the sugars in the flour, eating it, and making wonderful flavors of alcohol and making carbon dioxide, which is what makes the bread rise. A yeast is a live thing. It's a live organism, and that's what makes the process of making bread so thrilling. So I'm just going to let this process now. If I just did the nuts by themselves, they would turn to paste. The beauty of doing it with the flours is that I'm getting nut flour without it getting pasty, because the flours are keeping the nuts dry and not oily. I'm going to check and see if I have any particles of nuts, because this part should be all flour, and the only way I can really tell is if I take a little between my fingers and I feel the grittiness. It's more gritty than flour, but it's really a nut flour. Now I'm going to be able to use this flour and nut mixture to add to my sponge when I'm ready to make it. But the first thing that I do is the cranberries, and I'm using dried cranberries because if I used fresh cranberries, there's so much liquid in fresh cranberries it would make the dough muddy. I mean, it would make it really soupy. So I use dry cranberries, but to make them soften slightly, I'm going to soak them in water. I use hot water because it goes faster, and I let it soak for 30 minutes. They can soak longer, but as you can see from the ones that are soaked here, the water turns pink, and that's going to give the most beautiful rosy cast to the dough. So when I'm ready to start the dough, I'm going to be using this liquid as my liquid for the dough. But I might not have enough. If I don't have enough, I simply add tap water. Now I'm going to measure the cranberry juice, and I need to have a total of a cup, but there's never going to be that much because the cranberries absorbed some of the liquid. So just add enough to make the 1 cup. And this is enough nice pink color to turn your dough a beautiful rosy shade. I'm starting by weighing the flour. I like to weigh the flour because that way it's going to be the same consistency every time without having to adjust the water. But I will show you if you do it by volume or if you just do it casually and don't even measure anything, and your dough is sticky, how to make it stiffer. If it's the other way, you can make it moister. But this way, it always is right the first time, and I don't have to worry about it. So I like to start off with weight. And this is 5½ ounces, which is 1 cup of bread flour. Bread flour is a little heavier than all-purpose. That's how all these things vary. If you change the type of flour, you'll need more water because there's more protein, and more protein needs more water. Okay, that's the flour. And then I have malt powder or sugar. But don't use malt syrup because malt syrup is brown, and instead of having a rosy crumb, you'll have a brown crumb, tan. Then the instant yeast. I just want to mix the dry ingredients with the wet until it's the consistency of a pancake batter. You could just start with adding all the liquid, but I like to always add liquid gradually. It seems to incorporate better. There we go. And bring it up a little higher so it goes faster, because at this point, we're getting air into it as well. And those air bubbles are going to form the structure. You know how a nice crumb in bread has nice little pockets all the way through? This will be a fairly fine one. It's not one of those big open-hole sourdough breads. It's never going to mix in absolutely all of the flour at the edges, but I'm going to finish that off with a spatula. I'm scraping down all the side part so none of it comes up high on the bowl. And now I'm going to sprinkle the nut flour mixture on top. And at this point, you really don't have to go through this first fermentation if you don't want to. You can start mixing right away, but even a ½ hour of standing time in a bread will develop so much more flavor, and there's always something else to do in that ½ hour. Okay, and then I cover this with plastic wrap, and I have one that I've already made here, so I'm just going to use this to cover this one. And you'll see how the one that's been sitting for an hour has developed little cracks in the surface. If it sits for another ½ hour or 2 hours, depending on the temperature, I usually let it sit at around 75 degrees, between 70 and 80 for the best flavor, and that's the kitchen temperature. If it's sitting for a little longer, you'll see that the batter is coming right up through those little fissures, those cracks, and you'll see all this foaming batter. But that's fine because the plastic wrap's protecting it, so it's not going to crust. And now I can proceed to mixing the dough. I add a tablespoon of oil because that keeps the dough fresh longer. Now I'm using the dough hook, and you can see a dough hook is a special device that the stand mixer has. Now I'm going to mix it for about a minute, just until all the dry ingredients are moistened. Now you can see very quickly all the dry ingredients are getting mixed together with the liquid that was in the sponge. And at this point, if it looks too stiff or it looks too soft, don't worry, because we won't know until we start kneading it with a machine or by hand. You won't know if the liquid amount, the ratio of liquid to flour is right. So now we have just a few particles, and that's fine. And at this point, I like to cover it with a towel or plastic wrap and just let it sit for the 20 minutes. And what this technique called autolyse does, or you can just call it resting if you prefer, is that it enables all those dry ingredients to absorb the liquid ingredients, and then you don't need to add as much flour, so you have a moister dough. Now I'm going to let it sit for 20 minutes.